Hey everyone, today I am going to look at a limit hold'em hand from a live mix game that a student sent to me. So this is from a little bit of a smaller stakes mix game where maybe we'll see a lower aggression level overall, but I think that it's a pretty common spot that illustrates some important concepts for 3-bet pots. So the way the hand went, the hijack open raised, my student 3-bet on the button with pocket nines, the hijack called. It came king 6-5 rainbow, check, bet, call, turn 10 of spades, putting a flush draw, check, check, river offsuit 8, the hijack bet, and my student called with their nines and lost to ace king offsuit. So what can we make of this situation? One of the things I wanted to look at in the video today is comparing the pre-flop strategies that the hijack might take for a 4-bet pre-flop strategy versus calling their entire range, which we can kind of assume villain might do if they show up with ace-king offsuit on the river here. So I have two sims up in PioSolver, and in the first one we're just going to look at the very standard spot of the in-position player, the button here, facing a check on the flop, and we can see that against the capped range from hijack where they would have some 4-bets pre, we more or less bet 100% of the time. We have 59% equity range versus range on this flop texture, which is killing them, to say it lightly. And if I flip over to this one here, we see something a little bit different. Now, if I look at equity, we only have 55.5. By the way, that's still pretty good considering villain is capable of having aces, kings, ace, king. All of the premiums are still in villain's range. But nevertheless, we still have 55.5% equity as the in-position 3-better here and have a bit of domination on this board. But notice that we're only c-betting now 80% of the time. So things have changed. We do need to be a little bit more wary of the strong hands that villain was concealing pre-flop by a lack of a 4-bet. So this is a pattern that you can be pretty aware of in limit hold'em, which is that when your villain uncaps their range pre-flop by slow playing, you more or less take advantage of that by finding more checkbacks post-flop with your medium hands. And we can see some high frequency checks from hands like queens, which is probably the number one checking hand here, jacks, not so much from our nines, a little bit, but nines does want protection on this board from single overcard hands that we might be able to get to fold. Other hands like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 that are normally kind of value bets because we're just betting our entire range here, but now maybe we're thinking they're a little bit too thin when we're only pushing a smaller equity advantage. So when we do bet here, we can see that villain is going to go ahead and fast play the majority of his good hands with some slow plays coming from hands like aces and ace king. And after the initial decision to c-bet, the two simulations are not particularly different from each other. If we look in this one, villain doesn't have any of those premium hands in his range anymore, but he more or less just is still check raising with most of his king x, maybe a little bit more passive, and now the king queen is kind of taking the place as a bit of a slow play combination. So nothing too drastically different between the two strategies. Villain's raising 23% when he has a capped range, folding 15.5. Here he's raising 30%, folding 14. So, has to fold a little bit less because he has a little bit more strong hands, but just not a big difference overall. Anyway, we'll go ahead and think about the way the hand actually played out. Villain only called, and when the turn was the 10 of spades and got checked to, we can see that my student made a good decision to check back nines. Remember that villain is slow playing some aces and ace king, and nines is just a good combo to check here. It blocks some of the weaker peels from some gut shot kind of hands that would maybe have to fold on the turn here. If we look at some hands that are folding, we see jack 9, queen 9, 9-8 suited, 9-7 suited. So the nines is interfering with the obvious folds from villain, even ace 9 off, whereas it is not interfering with all of the good hands and all the hands that pick up equity on the 10 of spades. If hero were to bet the nines and get check raised, it is a continue, but it's basically 0 EV. If we look at the EV, we can see it's very, very low. It's a little above 0. 8s would be like 0 EV. So we would have a difficult decision against a tough player, against your typical small mid-stakes player here who's probably not going to find enough semi-bluff raises on the turn. You could make a strong argument for folding the nines to the turn bet, but I do think it's clear that checking behind is the best play on the turn the vast majority of the time with the nines. And if we take a look at the other sim to see any differences, I don't expect it to be drastically different. Now the nines is betting a little bit more because, again, our range is doing a little bit better against the capped range of villain, so that all makes sense. But hero's play was basically fine. On the river, we see something very similar across the two situations that is no changes, which is that now, as soon as hero checks behind, the button checks behind on the turn, out of position is in the driver's seat now. Now, out of position has 59% equity in this sim and 57 in this one. Both quite high, you know. And so we see villain out of position in both sims, employing a very liberal betting strategy 74% of the time, going for very thin value in some merge bets with strong hands all the way down to weak hands like ace-5, that's betting for value, and appears to be, you know, doing very well as a thin value bet that can get called by worse ace-high. Even ace-queen offsuit here is value betting, no pair, and certainly all sorts of any pair and then a lot of bluffs, right? So, you know, even the weak ace-x is finding bluffs. Ace-7 off looks to be a bluff. We have a few gut shot kind of combos like queen-9 suited that have arrived at the river as a bluff. Jack-9 suited appears to be bluffing a little less, maybe because villains, one of the hands that we'd be targeting for a fold would be ace-jack. Yep, that does make sense. So Jack-9 blocks one of the most likely folding combinations. Ooh, it blocks two of the most likely folding combinations. Notice how all this ace-9 suited exists in hero's range. So, you know, it's a very subtle thing to be thinking about on the river situation, but, you know, when you're choosing your bluffs, you do want to think about, well, do the cards in my hand impact the cards that villain could be folding, or does it make it easier for him to have a hand that can fold? So, pretty relevant. And if we look at nines, it's just a no-brainer call. It's winning a lot of chips because we're beating a bunch of value hands. So, yeah, hero played this hand basically totally fine. And it does appear that villain strategy is not too bad as long as, you know, he mixes on the flop with his ace-king. Was not a big deal. But at the time, I thought that villain strategy of slow playing pre was going to be a little bit worse. But remember, if you don't check behind on any flops, then they take advantage of that quite well, and slow playing pre-flop works out fine. So yeah, pretty interesting hand with some very common situations across all streets. Let me know what questions you have and what you think about my comments about the pre-flop decision for the out of position player. It's a pretty complicated question as to what is the best option when you're facing 3-bet pre-flop and you're out of position and you're deciding whether to play a 4-betting strategy or just calling. But some merits to each. So yeah, thanks for my student for sending in this hand, and let me know what you guys think. Talk to you all soon.